evening, wherever everybody is dialing in from. Welcome.
We're live on YouTube now.
So I can see the numbers going up. So we'll give it a few seconds so that we have critical mass so people don't miss anything in terms of intro. So bear with us. Okay, we'll let people come in. So I'll kick off now. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm Karthik Iyer. I'm Director of Programs at Climate Bonds Initiative. And along with KPMG, we have the pleasure of bringing together a great panel, which we hope will be interesting to all of you. And we also hope to get some questions from the audience, because we've got a really good bunch of people who have got a long and deep pedigree in sustainability and finance. So please make sure you have your questions ready. So Climate Bonds Initiative, which some of you may already know, is an international NGO. We are an investor-focused organization looking to mobilize capital towards climate change solutions, both mitigation and resilience. And we do that through multiple levers of policy, working closely with governments. We're also a standards body in defining what green looks like, and now more so with the expansion into transition, what good transition and credible transition looks like. Our team will send some links on some of the documents we've done on the concept of credible transition, which we did with Credit Suisse, but also specifically on what transition looks like for companies, as a discussion paper on what would look credible, which should be very topical given we have some companies on the call today, so we can discuss that and you can either go through that or ask questions or come back to us at a later time. So we are at a very unique juncture right now, post COP26 and IPCC, the whole sense of urgency, almost a race against time, not that it wasn't there before. And I guess for many of us in India and elsewhere too, we felt some of those real impacts of climate change in terms of drastic weather changes and heat. But more importantly is for today's session, we're focusing more on the opportunities. So I won't dwell too much on the usual doom and gloom. What we want to focus on is how do we make the opportunities work in achieving the 1.5 degree target for the planet, right, to make it livable. But I guess the key question while talking on opportunities is, are we on track? And how do we know we are on track, and is it enough? Yeah. And that comes through in terms of how we can make sure the right enabling environment is there in terms of policy, as well as microeconomics of companies, and finance, which is a key part. And we are lucky today to have some people from the finance industry who can tell us, and we can glean some learnings from other parts of the world, but equally also what's happening in India. And I guess on that point with Barbara, who's from Morgan Stanley, given it's one of the, and I started my career there in mutual funds, it's been one of the oldest mutual funds, international mutual funds, to enter India back in the 90s. So both institutionally and individually, I'm hoping Barbara and Shrey too, with LSEG's long heritage and partnership with India, both as a market infrastructure player as well as data provider platform through Refinitiv, that we can learn a lot from you. And last but not least, the fact that we've got three key industry players who actually are in the midst of the whole transition journey, and it's very complex and easier said than done. So with cements and industry and mining, as well as to get the actual feel on the ground. And Apurva, who's and KPMG, who've got a wealth of advisory as well as assurance experience with KPMG over the years with 175 experts, and they've actually worked with many of the companies here and others in helping them on their journey, as well as providing assurance services in green finance and green bonds. And we've had the pleasure of working with them, not only in India, but globally as verifiers, because we also provide certification of green bonds as climate bonds. So between us, hopefully we'll have an enjoyable discussion, also provoke some thoughts with the audience. So without much further ado, I'll actually pass on to you, Apurva, to kick off a series of introductions by each of the panelists. And we are fortunate we have alphabetical order. So Apurva, Barbara, Gaurav, Manish, Shrey, and Vishal, I guess. And then please go for it. Over to you, Apurva. Just one quick housekeeping, apologies to interrupt your kickoff. For the audience, please use the Q&A session. We'll try and keep some time at the end. But if you want to put any questions, comes up to your mind, use the Q&A box because that'll be easily accessible. And then thanks to a great webinar and comms team who's been supporting us. Thanks to Leticia, she'll be keeping us on our toes, both from a time and any other logistics perspective. Back to you, Apurva. Thank you.
Thanks, Karthik. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Apurva Mitra. I'm an associate partner in the ESG practice in KPMG India. Over the years, I've focused on a variety of climate-relevant topics such as deep decarbonization, energy transitions, carbon markets, platform building, just transition, complexity economics, and various other pieces. I've worked with the private sector, but also quite closely with the government on policy, and have been part of various Government of India committees on net zero and deep decarbonization. Thanks. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Barbara Calvi. I'm an executive director in the fixed income sustainable investing team with Morgan Stanley Investment Management, sitting in London. And as part of my daily work, clearly look at many of the labeled green, social, sustainability transactions that come to market, but also at ESG integration methodologies and the way we invest in our labeled sustainable bond funds. And before joining the investment management side of Morgan Stanley, I was with their capital markets team dedicated to structuring green and sustainable bonds. So I've had the pleasure of seeing both sides of the market, and glad to be here today. Thank you.
Excellent. A lot of questions to you then, Barbara. Gaurav, over to you.
Thanks, Karthik. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Gaurav Sarup. I'm Director for ESG, Carbon and Social Performance at Vedanta Limited. Over the last 2 years, the bulk of my working hours have been spent in helping Vedanta formulate its net zero strategy, and hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit today. But for the last 10 years, I've been in this industry since 2014 with Vedanta, starting off in their oil and gas business, setting up their sustainability function there. But I've also done some years as a consultant, working with multiple industries and on multiple topics around corporate sustainability, including a lot of disclosure work and a lot of maturity assessment, etc. And just had a brief stint with Tata Power when I started working in this space. So that's a little bit about me, and looking forward to the interaction today.
Thank you. I think it's Manish next, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks, Karthik. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Lieutenant Colonel Monish Ahuja. I'm the promoter, chairman, managing director of Punjab Renewable Energy Systems Private Limited, acronymed as PRESPL. My field of work and our company is supporting the decarbonization, removal of fossil fuel from wherever it is used. And this we feel and we work is from the biomass and bioenergy route. So we are focused on 365 days, 24/7, sustainable energy to be provided. And these are in both the buckets. It is the electricity segment, and away from it, the larger piece of, and looking at the India market, about 82% of the energy basket that we are servicing or intend to service. We have a pan-India presence, and we are now working uniquely with the large consumer energy industries for their decarbonization goals to be met. Thank you so much. Look forward to this session.
Thank you. Your next, Shrey. Yeah.
Thank you, Karthik. And good morning, good afternoon. It's a delight to be on such a distinguished panel. My name is Shrey Kohli. I am Director and Head of Debt Capital Markets at the London Stock Exchange, part of the LSE Group. In my role, I also head up the LSE Sustainable Bond Market, which is a home to over $150 billion, more than 300 financial instruments in green, social, sustainability or sustainability linked format, where we've seen debut milestone transactions from across the world, including the first certified CBI certified issuances from India, China, the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas. So we work very closely with companies as they seek to raise capital from global financial markets, and quite often they do it in conjunction with domestic markets. Some of our clients in India, for example, include Exim Bank, HDFC, IRFC, who themselves have gone forward in terms of setting their own transition climate-related strategies. And given some of the significant investment requirements of the hour, over 9 trillion estimated by McKinsey, for example, to facilitate the energy transition, the climate transition over the next 20 to 25 years on an annual basis, we feel that global markets like the LSE can play a key role in terms of facilitating that channel in India. I started my career as a consultant as well. I can see a lot of consultants on this panel. So look forward to engaging in a productive discussion.
Thank you. Over to you, Vishal.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for people who have joined. I am Vishal Bhavsar, and I am part of Ultratech Cement. And Ultratech Cement is one of the business of Aditya Birla Group. I lead the sustainability and ESG agenda for Ultratech Cement. Ultratech is the largest cement and concrete company in India, and it is third largest globally. So the challenge for us is humongous in terms of the ambitious targets what we have put. So I work with internal stakeholders, largely my business teams, as well as external stakeholders to drive the net zero agenda, specifically which is topical for today's session. In my previous role, I have also been a consultant, and prior to Aditya Birla Group, I have also worked with the other two large groups, which is Mahindra and Tata. So I think that's all from my side right now.
Thank you. Thank you. What a rich panel. And as Shrey pointed out, quite a few people with a lot of varied background in the past. And I think that's great because I still remember when we first kicked this off 5 years ago, we used to call it different names before it became transition. It used to be called brown to green, right? As a movement where we were talking with all the investors as to what we need to do. And the key was that, look, just looking at pure play solar wind is not enough. We need to take this across the breadth of the industry and deeper in as well as depth to make this happen. Otherwise, we're not going to make the 1.5. However, the moment you go into more complex industry, and it's a classic case here with mining, cement, and not just to say that even others are complex, that you get into this whole value chain of what happens through the whole process of what an industry does. So it's quite a tricky one, which we need to unpack today. What I want to do now is that before we go into a bit of a macro session, I think we need to just understand what our enablers are, what the barriers are. We need to figure out what has been done so far. So we're going to do a macro on the policy environment and how we're looking at it from a broader perspective. But before we do that, especially for India, what we wanted to do was do a quick poll with the audience because we can baseline what the general feel is in the audience and between us as a group. So Letitia, if you could help us with the first quick intro poll, we can use that as a basis for our next discussion. So the big question is, which sectors face the greatest challenge in India's journey to net zero? So we put a few there. Just pick three, so the answer, the question here is, as we said earlier, how do we know we're on track? What do we focus on? It's, in a very simple terms, no different from what we do at work or even at home. I've got so much to do. What do I look at and where do I get the biggest bang for buck? So let's get a sense of that. No right or wrong answers, but it just gives a good baseline for us to then discuss further. So hopefully the panelists and the people can vote. Or I think, no, the audience can vote. So we'll wait for the audience to, and see it live. So if you can open the poll, that'll be great, Leticia. Thank you.
Can you see the poll?
I can, yes, I hope everybody can, yeah.
Yep, but we can't vote.
got a message just saying we can't see the results. We can't see the live results. I don't know if you're getting responses or we need to wait a bit more.
We have 59 answers out of 75.
All right. Okay. So the screen doesn't show the results yet. So hopefully that comes up shortly.
Yeah, it does when I close the poll.
Okay. Sorry.
So 64 answers now. Should I close it?
Yeah, I think so. Just in the interest of time, I think it just gives us a sense, then we can kick off the discussions.
Okay. Can you see the results?
So, yes, I can now. It's interesting. The steel, cement, energy, right at the top, transport, building, and agriculture. I have some thoughts. I'll just open up to the panelists to give some reactions, and that can also lead into what the macro environment is and also what our feelings are on that. Thank you for people who have answered. Sorry, we couldn't keep it open for longer. We just want to make sure that we make use of the time so that we can get into the discussion. Why don't I kick off with Gaurav? Gaurav, I know you need to jump off for a call, so do you want to react to that?
Sure. Thank you, Karthik. I think our audience is very well aware of the subject, and I think the fact that steel, cement have been identified as sectors which are hard to abate, I think it's almost a no-brainer. But being part of a company that is in one of those sectors, I think I can go and talk about that too, Karthik. But unless you want to open it up to the other panelists, and then we can take.
Yeah, just initial reactions, and we can open it up in terms of time. Who else wants to jump in? Open session.
Yeah, I wonder whether those who voted for energy voted for the power sector or energy in totality, including thermal and power. Because I do agree that the power sector has its own challenges, but and yeah, I mean, even for the power sector, although we have shown remarkable sort of progress in the last 2 decades, the sector is still plagued with challenges around power system flexibility constraints. We don't have enough storage in the grid. We still need to rely on coal for base load. Land is limited, whether it's for biomass or for setting up large RE installations. Distribution systems are in poor health. And so these are all common issues across the power sector, I feel, given that, even if renewables, for example, have, must-run status, but in a lot of states in the recent past, we've seen a lot of curtailments, specifically in the south. So there's still a lot to be done in terms of, ramping up storage, promoting hybrid systems, promoting rooftop solar, which hasn't seen that kind of uptake. And maybe some of these challenges that plague, say, the rooftop sector could be solved with better forecasting and scheduling of power in the future. So I think the power sector has its unique set of challenges, but when we talk about industry, I think we have to recognize that power is a very small component of the energy consumption of industry. I mean, in the near term, it could be around 15 to 20%. Heat and other energy sort of applications, and I think that's where it gets real tricky, because and I'll talk about it later. I think when we talk about the macro picture, that perhaps technologies are limited for near-term application, specifically for heat and energy and process applications.
Thank you. I take your point about power. In fact, initially I had electricity and power separately, but I kept it deliberately as energy, because I think Manish, you mentioned this in one of our discussions. People tend to just gravitate towards the usual suspect and also in India, because we had such a big heritage of the RE sector and solar in such a big way, but it's much broader than that. But I'm equally glad that we had among the top steel and cement, because it's so slowly sort of seeping through in terms of other sectors. And as you said, energy goes into buildings, it goes into EV and transport. So it's difficult how you cut and slice it, but equally it seems well distributed. So who else wants to go next? Trey, do you want to react to any of those?
Yeah, look, I agree with sorry, Manish, just very quickly. So I agree with the comments made. I mean, power is an interesting one, because at least in Europe, some of the issues around power is more about offshore versus onshore. As Apurva said, energy efficiency and batteries, for example, battery storage, larger batteries for the grid so that peak hours and off-peak hours are not isn't as much of a delta as there is now. I think building is an interesting one, particularly in a country like India, where there is in Europe, I would say the challenge is more brownfield building requirements where you're changing infrastructure which already exists to standards which are more efficient now. Whereas in India, it's probably a mix between brownfield and greenfield projects where you're not only creating new infrastructure, but you're also renewing old infrastructure. So that's an interesting one, and it really ties very closely with the supply chain, which I know Munish and Vishal are obviously close to, and businesses like Ultratech playing a key role in terms of providing cement, which is created in an efficient manner so that the scope 3 emissions of a particular project are not very high. So it's quite interesting to see the results. And as Gaurav said, it seems that the audience is a very knowledgeable audience space.
Great stuff. Yeah. Gaurav, conscious of your time, so Gaurav, I'm going to let you, before you jump off, have a word. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Karthik. So just before I begin, a quick word about Vedanta. For those of you who do not know, we are among the 6th largest natural resources company in the world, perhaps the largest in India. We have a diverse set of metals and minerals that we produce, right? So we were doing an analysis last week, and if I know 9 of the 17 metals that would be required for the new green economy to emerge, Vedanta has them in the portfolio, right? Whether it's zinc, aluminium, iron ore, steel, copper, these cobalt, nickel. So all of these very essential elements are part of our portfolio, and that makes us really, really excited because it gives us an opportunity to contribute towards what clearly is a pressing and urgent need of our times. As a company, we're also we operate across the globe, but predominantly in India, South Africa, and Namibia. We also have operations in Australia and Ireland and UAE. Recently, as of October last year, we did commit ourselves to becoming a net zero organization by 2050 or sooner, right? So that's a little bit of about what Vedanta does and where we are coming from for this conversation. Generally, I think setting up the conversation around the macro picture. I think we are fortunate to be in a country that is very, very gung-ho about transitioning to green. I think the commitment that we made in COP26 to get to net zero by 2070, I think, is a reasonably realistic scenario, given what we're seeing in the country, given the fact that we are an economy that's predominantly powered by coal. We are also a country where the government is very keen on having us get to achieve those large numbers on renewable, right? So whether it's 450 gigawatts by 2030 or any of those other green targets that we are taking as a company, as a country. Now, in terms of large business, right? When we start talking about net zero at Vedanta, some of the key considerations that we had and we continue to have really is how do we ensure that we are able to get 24/7 stable power, right? Especially at the scale that we are talking at. Given the size of our business, given the fact that we have, we operate everything from overground to underground mines to smelting pot lines, etc. Our overall energy requirement is around 9 gigawatts today, right? And with our net zero commitment, the idea is to get that to zero in the next 30. How do we do that? Really, what we've kind of thought about is kind of breaking this down into chunks that we can chew, and essentially over the next 8 years, by 2030, get to about 2.5 gigawatts of round the clock renewable, or round the clock equivalent renewable, really. In order to do that, there are a lot of a lot of things that need to come into place to make that happen. Clearly, while these numbers are essential and we need to get there, what I think is important to note is that if you look at it from a large consumer standpoint, this scale of renewables has not been attempted before, right? So as we go about putting up 200, 500 megawatts of round-the-clock renewable or round-the-clock equivalent renewable, there are multiple challenges that we are starting to see emerge, right? Whether it's from a wheeling and grid connectivity perspective, whether it is how do you define captive power use, whether all of the multiple challenges that you have between interstate transfer, or the central and state question around energy use. So all of those things become questions that we have to start addressing and tackling. And I think the answers for that we will start to find as this implementation starts to play out on the ground itself. Some of the things that at least for our industry that have really, really driven the conversation, a lot of it has actually come as a push from our investors. And we as a company regularly engage with all of the major investment classes and investment organizations, right? So whether it's the CA 100 or whether it's any of the rating agencies, we've had a steady line of scrutiny and question on this organization, especially because in the Indian context, people understand that there is a large energy base which is being powered from coal, and coal is one of those fuels that in the long term we know needs to get removed from the energy mix. But how do you do that, and what can help us get there really is something that we've been seeing as an organization, and that's really been driving the conversation on this.
I was going to say before you, because you need to jump off, quick reaction. Thanks for the overview. Reaction to the poll. Did you feel that sector coverage was representative, or did you feel that mining should have been in there more explicitly, for example?
I think mining needs to be there more. I will obviously say that. Aluminium, you missed out. Aluminium is a huge power, it has huge power requirements. Although once you start recycling it, those requirements come significantly down. But at least as a country, we're a little bit far away from being able to get to those numbers just yet. But yeah, this is a fundamental industry for everything that we want to do, right? So green will not happen unless mining takes off, and how we do mining really is of consequence to the world, and that's kind of what we are focused on.
So true, yeah. So let's unpick some of that when you come back. I think there's a lot of the what we've talked. The how, as you pointed out, is quite important, not just from a decarbonization point of view, but also the social side of things. So I'm hoping some of the others can jump in on the just transition aspect of how we're not leaving people behind, and both mining and equally cement and other sectors which are multi-value chain that comes into play. I'll pass on to Monish. I know you were trying to come in earlier, Monish, and then Barbara.
Thanks, Karthik.
Reactions on the poll, and also a segue.
Yeah, so I still feel on the India context, agriculture at the 30% was a bit subdued. It's one of the largest consumers of energy. The second part, besides that, if you look at the construct of the narrative, and we spoke about it earlier, you mentioned it, we are still talking about electrons on the 18% of the energy mix. And we are at 100 gigawatt, but we are still 20% of that 18%. So we are actually looking at the transition maybe at the wrong door. It needs to be at the 82% of the energy mix, and that's cooking, agriculture, transportation, aviation, shipping, thermal energy, cooling energy. And if we are able to do that, then the focus of what we want to achieve could be met. I'll give you some specific examples and be patient here. Every Hindu cremation in India, we cut down 2 trees of average life 5 to 6 years. That means, and we are a population of 130 billion number, 70% of them Hindu cremation. Entire sourcing of this wood is unsustainable. We cut down trees, urban local bodies, rural bodies, and these 2 tree 10-year life, Supreme Court has put a life on the tree per year at 74,500 rupees. It's a national asset. That means per cremation, we burn 7.5 lakh worth of national asset. And the cost recovery is shockingly 3,500 to 4,000 rupees. Sometimes paid by urban local bodies, sometimes by the family, and most of the time by NGOs. And here we are talking about billions to go in creating forests as carbon sinks. Point 1. Point 2, when you look at the carbon and with all due respect to industrialization, development, mining, so on and so forth, we are only talking about fossil to be taken out from the earth. We're talking about round the clock RE, and you're talking about mining negative carbon, putting it in place. And the biggest and the simplest natural solution of RTC is biomass. You have agriculture crop residue, you have sustainable plantation, which is a carbon sink. You take out the carbon from the air and you utilize it for your energy needs. And on a LCOE basis, it is cheaper. You look at the entire industry segment, and there we are talking about electricity as one requirement, but their heating and cooling solutions are just not in the radar. So our new and renewable energy industry is Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. They don't have even one scheme on energy. It is only electricity. And I told the Honorable Minister a couple of years back, why don't you change the name of your ministry? Because there is no central financial assistance on anything except for electricity. And that's the easy route, because you buy a panel, you buy a windmill, and you put it on the ground. Who's going to do the difficult part? Who's going to ask the difficult questions? If you look at the segment to address, and that's where this sustainability segment needs to come from, abating the 82% of the energy. We have in India, and these are tough questions to ask, since 7 years announced a biofuel policy. We have a constant statement, in 2 years we go live with the projects. Even today, after 7 years, we are 2 years to go live. We do not have the wherewithal to put a fix on the price matrix, and it is required. You are not going to achieve this sustainability goal unless we are willing to pay for it. Today, we are saying buy coal-based power capped by regulation at 12 rupees a unit. Why don't we produce biomass IPP at 7 rupees a unit? Because the DISCOM says it is expensive to buy. But 12 rupees on an exchange coal is cheap to buy because you don't have it. So I think a lot manner in which we are constructing the climate debates need to change. You keep doing your electricity, you will keep, getting to a point where the grids will start collapsing. You'll start getting to infirm power. Industries will start moving to more diesel because they need to run industries. They will start using coal mined in illegal ways, and so on and so forth. So I think the climate ministries are not in sync with the energy ministries, and vice versa. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that sort of puts the finger straight into what we were saying earlier about being so focused on energy or power and looking beyond the hard-to-abate sectors. Maybe this is the point to open up a bit more, because I know, Apurva, you're looking, KPMG is looking cross-sector, and you can come in as well. And Vishal, both as a consumer of energy, which is crucial for cement, and also downstream and upstream. And then Barbara, maybe I can come back to you on that, and we can go into the investor view, so that comes together a bit. So first with you, Apurva, if you can come back to Monish's comments. And I think I'll put the overarching question there is that, what is that we need more of? So we hear about all the PLIs and the incentives from the government. We're hearing about the green hydrogen policy, the DISCOM privatization, and so on and so forth. So what exactly, to Monish's point, are we missing here? Because if we don't do that, no matter how much Gaurav, Vishal, and others are doing as individual companies, we won't get to the end game, right? So what is it that's needed at an enabling level? Over to you, Apurva.
Sure, Karthik. Thanks. No, I completely agree with Monish. From the industry perspective, while clean energy is one of the key levers, it's just one of the levers, right? And clearly not enough to just electrify or decarbonize the electricity source, but meeting heat and energy requirements of industry through clean ways becomes actually substantially more important in these hard-to-abate sectors. In the near term, energy efficiency could be a lower-hanging fruit, but to mitigate more deeply, other low-carbon fuels such as green hydrogen, green ammonia, sustainability sort of produced biomass or waste is needed. We also need technological breakthroughs in, say, CCUS or other solutions to reduce process emissions. Let's take the example of the cement sector because we've been talking about that. Process and fuel related emissions both account for quite a significant portion of the total emissions from cement. So both process modification and energy efficiency become quite important for mitigation in the cement sector. Specifically from the hard-to-abate side, we know that producing clinker is carbon intensive due to the calcination process and their process heat requirements. So an important sort of lever for reducing demand for clinker is one such option, right? Like by substituting it with waste materials like blast furnace slag or coal ash. And then there are these energy efficiency sort of levers such as waste heat recovery that could sort of reduce emissions significantly. We also know that industry is trying to switch to biomass to replace coal and boilers. We've had conversations with several industry folks, and we've seen that availability has become a big challenge, increasingly in several regions across the country, especially in the north, because there are a lot of competing uses of biomass. And so it may not be like a long-term viable solution. If you look at the long term, hydrogen and CCS or CCUS are the only sort of visible options for the longer term, while energy efficiency, clinker substitution, all of that can provide sort of incremental benefits in the short term. But eventually, we will need these new technologies to play a big role. So developing that ecosystem for these technologies for the longer term, it will set us up for the longer term. The latest IPCC report also clearly says that, if you want to align to the 1.5 degree pathways, then it becomes impossible without CCUS. And CCUS at this point, and India focuses more on CCUS than CCS, right? It's not the storage, but the utilization component that is favored. It's hard to make economical unless you can find meaningful ways to utilize the CO2 that's captured or safe ways to kind of store it in geological sites, which is not necessarily the focus right now in India. So it's difficult to do, at least in the near term. Aside from this, there are opportunities around material efficiency, circularity, within the heavy industry, which can perhaps to a greater degree lead to, one particular study says, almost to the extent of 40% can help us reduce emissions from the industry sector. And then if you look at the value chain, if you look at upstream, downstream, right, technology sort of options for equipment such as, say, dumpers and loaders, right? Most cement companies have their own, so it's scope one for them. But there are no sort of electric options at present to substitute these, right? And similarly, the mining part of the value chain that you touched upon, limited options. We look at logistics also, upstream, downstream logistics. Again, aside from, say, modal shift or route optimization, EV freight options are also quite limited. So, and it's a technology issue. We're hoping that it will at one point, once hydrogen comes in, fuel cells come in, these battery sizing issues around EVs can then take a backseat. So while our sort of long-term vision could be centered around these long-term technology solutions, the sort of near-term solutions at this point are limited. And when I'm talking about hydrogen, just to keep in mind that I'm talking about green hydrogen. Brown hydrogen that's already sort of traditionally produced by reforming isn't the solution of the future, right? So the point I'm trying to make is incrementally there's a lot we can do today, but as a step jump, we need for the ecosystem around these technologies to develop, right? But from the finance side, we understand that investors are increasingly going wary of investments in these sectors because they're all looking to decarbonize their portfolios now, right? They're trying to measure the impact of their portfolio, set benchmarks, and we're working with, for example, a bank to understand how they could align their investments to make sure that it's on track with 1.5 degrees temperature pathways, right? And clearly, given the technology sort of limitations I just spoke about, if one has to align to science, the exposure to these industries itself, along with coal, is something that the investors are forced to reconsider. So like I said, industry is in a bit of a sticky place because while the options are limited, at the same time, funding is also limited. But finance can be the big driver. If you specifically look at the debt markets and shares here, and we'll probably talk about that more, there's huge traction in terms of incentivizing ESG-linked performance, right, by the way of sustainability-linked bonds. These SLB instruments have actually gained a lot of favor in the recent past because rather than committing to a specific sort of use of proceeds in terms of green assets, you can actually use it to commit to sort of meeting certain sustainability targets or metrics on a corporate level. So, for example, meeting the company's scope 1 or scope 2 emissions footprint, or target rather, or reducing waste, reducing water use, reducing plastic. World over, these are all the different kinds of metrics that have been used. So if you look at India, if you look at Ultratech, and maybe Vishal will talk about that a bit more, is the metric is that they're going to reduce emissions by 22%, 22.2%, I think, if they're within this particular SLB target. So while in India, this the uptake is still slow in SLBs, it's a nascent space, but they've really sort of picked up steam internationally in 2021. Given that they were virtually non-existent in 2020, to how they've grown this year is quite exceptional, right? A lot of analysts actually predict that perhaps the SLB market will actually the segment will overtake the green bond segment, right? So my limited point here is that there is real potential for the financial markets to actually drive the change, and we can already see that happening in the way that markets are panning out today and the momentum that has already picked up. I'm happy to respond to the just transition the aspect you mentioned, but happy to also come back to it if you like after that.
Yeah, why don't we come back to it, because there's some questions on what the investors are looking for. But before that, Vishal, if you can also react both to the sectoral parts and how it applies to you. But thank you, Apurva. I was just going to say, so there's the long and short term dichotomy, obviously, and you mentioned the instruments. But before we come to the instruments, which I'm sure Barbara and Shrey will give us a lot more insights about from the buy side, Vishal, so that we can complete the cycle in terms of your reactions.
Thanks, Karthik. So I think I'll just go back to the poll which had come in. I think it easily mirrors to what, let's say, report which ETC would have published some years back in terms of hard to abate sectors. Of course, the sector from where I belong, cement. Similarly, other sectors like power, steel, all of those are getting categorized as hard to abate. But as I said in one of the conversation, we would want to call ourselves as possible to abate and not to hard to abate, because there has to be an optimist lens to look at the real issue of solving the whole decarbonization challenge. So that's in terms of overall sector. From an Ultratech point of view or a cement sector point of view, if you look at Indian cement sector has adopted sustainability almost like a couple of decades back. And when you try to look at the performance on overall carbon, and when you break down the carbon performance in terms of energy metrics or alternative fuel or green products, on all of those metrics, actually, Indian cement companies are doing way better in terms of the global peers. So if you see, Indian cement is, in terms of clinker factor or in terms of the average CO2 emission, it is the lowest globally. When I have to contextualize it from an Ultratech point of view, in a year we consume so much of waste material in form of industrial waste, agro waste, then a lot of hazardous, non-hazardous waste in form of alternative material and fuel. And if I have to try to equate it in terms of CO2 saving, it is almost to a tune of almost 10 million tons of CO2 gets saved in a year because of sheer consumption of these alternative materials which are there up for us. So yes, that is in terms of effort of decarbonization. There are various levers which I think Apurva did touch upon, but I would want to talk more on things which are there in our operational control. All of us are really doing, as well as, let's say, Ultratech is also working on things like energy efficiency, new product which influences the clinker factor, which lowers the CO2 footprint. But we are also aggressively going into adoption of green technology from energy point of view. And not just from electrical energy point of view, but the alternative fuel helps us in reducing the thermal part, which Monish also alluded to. So it is not energy from an electrical standpoint, but also from a thermal energy point of view. So there we are consuming a lot of waste. We are also looking at biomass as a possible solution to reduce the dependence on fossil fuel, which is coal and petcoke. And in terms of these are more of in terms of short-term technologies or short-term option which we are looking at. But in terms of longer-term option, let's say if I have to replace the thermal fuel, then company and the whole sector actually is also looking at electrifying the whole clinkerization process. Now we know that this technology doesn't exist, but let's say Ultratech as well as most of the large cement companies are member to GCCA, which is Global Cement and Concrete Association. where a research project is going on, which is called as Project Innovandi, where this particular technology of completely electrifying the kiln operation is being looked at from a long-term point of view. And from a longer-term point of view, the second technology, of course, which we are betting on is carbon capture and utilization. One point attached to carbon capture as a technology, if you look at Indian context, as Apurva was saying, we are looking at utilization. We are banking more on capturing the carbon and utilizing the carbon because of course, not much of storage sites been available as of now. But when you look at SBTi, which is forming a guidance on net zero, they are saying carbon capture and utilization part, they are saying will not be part of your net zero, but it is only storage. So there are a lot of challenges for the sector as well. And last point, of course, we are looking at finance also. So looking at short-term technology, looking at longer-term technology, but adoption of this longer-term technology will come from innovative ways of tapping financial options, and sustainability linked bonds has been one great example from our side, where last year we went out and we raised the finance of almost $400 million through SLB route. And there we attached our CO2 intensity as a key KPI. And it's a no-brainer because for our sector, the topmost material issue is carbon footprint or the CO2 emission. That's why that KPI has been chosen. And so the point which I'm making is, of course, companies will have to look at new technologies, but companies will also have to look at newer ways of financing or capitalizing this technology in long run.
Thank you, Vishal. There's quite a few themes coming up. There's also some interesting points on the chat and the Q&A. I'll actually move to the investor side with Barbara and Shrey, because some of them might be answered. But there's a question about what kind of KPIs do we look for in terms of investment. I also like the question about MSMEs. So how are we making sure that finance reaches MSMEs? I don't know if somebody here, I think Manish, you're working with some of the companies who are doing the biogas sort of generation, but what is available for them now? In other markets that I'm involved in and with ADB, where I advise, we're looking at MSME loans, sustainability linked loans, not just the bonds, because that's sort of at their different tier. But I think why we twist this from a investor point of view, because I think if you're honest to ourselves, we still haven't answered the social question. There's a technology question, there's a reskilling question. So, and I know from my own experience with the focus on SDGs and socials becoming more and more part of the climate formula, maybe Barbara, you can kick us off in terms of what investors look for, and based on what you've just heard and all the things that India is trying to do and companies are trying to do. But how do you, if you were looking at asset allocation for your portfolio, how do you compare what do you want, what do you look for, and what would make you put money in the right place?
Absolutely, thank you, Kartik. No, there's a lot of aspects that have already been touched upon. But to your point specifically, well, first of all, I think it's a matter of defining what we consider as sustainable, right? I mean, all renewable energy, green hydrogen investments are clearly very straightforward. But as you know, for example, in Europe, we're moving towards the definition of a so-called taxonomy of what qualifies as environmentally sustainable. So even to the point that was raised about biomass, for example, there would be certain criteria within which this could also be qualifying as a green activity. And, under the Climate Bonds Initiative, you also have some specific standards around that. So the setting of frameworks of definition, clearly defining in a transparent way any sort of selection criteria that have been applied to projects is particularly important from an investor perspective, to have as much visibility as possible into what we are going to invest in through these instruments, because ultimately the real power of these green labels, these sustainable bond labels, lays in the extra transparency and visibility that it gives us on those projects and assets. Secondly, I would say from a KPI perspective, I mean, clearly the most commonly used one when it comes to the sustainability linked bond market that Apurva referred to have certainly been around like emissions reduction, but increasingly we also see KPIs, for example, on the efficiency of certain technologies, which are particularly helpful. In some cases, we're starting to see some examples of issuers that try to combine the green dimension with the social one, and also include some social KPIs in their issuance. Clearly, as mentioned, the Indian sustainability linked bond market is still nascent, is still relatively small. I believe there's only been about 4 issuance, including the Ultratech one, in this particular format. But clearly, with the upcoming investments, including through sort of leveraging all of the incentives that are coming from the government, there is huge potential to also leverage this additional financing tool. One particular sort of red flag and challenge that I would highlight as part of this market, though, is that there's a very fine balance between setting sort of targets that are considered ambitious, but that are also credible, and the company feels comfortable enough about achieving in the future. What we are starting to see in Europe is that, as a result of the current energy crisis that has in part also been triggered by the ongoing conflict, is that some issuers are starting to be off track regarding the KPIs and targets that they have set in the context of some of their sustainability-linked bonds, but even at the bilateral lending level. And so are starting to explore ways to potentially revise those targets downwards. Now, clearly, from an investor perspective, this is a very bad signal. Whenever companies are considering the issuance of a sustainability-linked bond, we would assume that they have sort of done internally all of the right sort of scenario analysis. They have tested multiple assumptions, which include some potential sort of turmoil. Clearly, in some cases, such as this one, this can be considered as exceptional, extreme circumstances. But nevertheless, we fight with a situation where, on one hand, we have seen a tendency in the market for issuers to set targets that, in many cases, are already, from our perspective, not incredibly ambitious, with a few exceptions. But at the same time, they're also wanting now to revise them on the downward side, which is even worse. So it's a very important moment in time, I would say, for the sustainability-linked bond market to reaffirm its credibility, and for issuers to really sort of step up the efforts in order to try their best to go back on track, at least with respect to the original targets that they had set on their pathway to net zero. And in this context, seeking external sort of partnership verification, such as the Science Based Targets Initiative, for example, amongst others that are out there, like Ultratech has done, for example, it's very important also from an investor perspective. It gives us reassurance that, at least in terms of the pathway, the trajectory, this has been stamped from a recognized independent body with a very strong scientific base. So these extra assurances are particularly important, especially in relation to emerging markets investments. Now, stepping back to the just transition, the social side of things, I would look at it in two ways. Well, first of all, I was mentioning there are some issuers that are exploring the addition of social KPIs, and this is clearly very welcome. The just transition clearly should be interpreted mostly as an opportunity, in my view, especially from countries as large as India. I mean, the market opportunity, the consumer opportunity of offering sort of affordable, clean energy is just absolutely huge, and it can represent a lot in terms of the financial returns as well. There's also, from an investor perspective, a risk mitigation angle that needs to take into consideration alongside the opportunity dimension. And this is mainly led by a lot of regulation that we are being subjected to, especially on the European side, but it's increasingly coming at the international level across geographies. And this is the so-called concept of do no significant harm or mitigating principal adverse impacts. This is some of the terminology that is used by European legislation, notably the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation or the EU taxonomy. So from our perspective, looking into responsible management of supply chains, looking at screening of human and labor rights. This is not just a nice to have, it's an absolute must have. And we would not want to invest in companies that are exposed to severe sort of controversies or issues that are related to these topics, because we must abide by principles of responsible investments, not only for the sustainable funds, but across the board. So we only expect this level of scrutiny and due diligence to increase going forward. And we expect to ask companies an increasing sort of amount of evidence in relation to how they are engaged with their own underlying suppliers in monitoring all of these aspects. There's been a recent announcement, for example, by the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, about a new stewardship and engagement initiative that has been launched, particularly targeted at metals and mining companies, as well as renewable energy players, so covering quite a number also of utility companies, especially targeted towards the promotion of human rights monitoring. So definitely a growing focus, and very rightly so. Again, both from a risk mitigation perspective, but we would very much welcome also the proactive efforts by company to also capture the opportunity that comes from sort of investing in just transition solutions.
Thanks. Very interesting to look at just transition as an opportunity, but equally it is complex, I guess, and we need to get into the detail. We may come back to Vishal and Gaurav because you can reflect on how that plays out for you, given you're looking at SLBs, or you have been doing SLBs, Vishal, and this whole debate where we look at SLBs versus use of proceeds, where it's based on the target versus actual underlying assets. But before that, Shrey, can I ask you to come in as well from LSEG and broader market perspective, and maybe also the point about disclosure, visibility, and regulation. Over to you.
Yeah, of course. And look, there's a lot to unpack in this discussion, because we've touched across a number of themes already. But perhaps to take one of the questions which has been asked, which is whether green financing has largely ignored the MSME sector. Sometimes you can flip that question around and say, has the MSME sector largely ignored green financing? But the point being, we have to move from a phase where ESG is considered niche and part of corporate responsibility to where ESG is BAU, or business as usual. And there's an alphabet soup of standards which exists internationally. But I think to the point that Vishal and Barbara were trying to make, there's an incentive from a company perspective to provide more transparency about their business operations, about their governance, about their supply chains, about their emissions, about their plans for the future, because ultimately it's linked to a regulatory stick approach where investors have to provide disclosure on where they invest and therefore their impact. But also there's a carrot, which is those companies which provide better disclosure and set ambitious strategies and adhere to targets and can stick to pathways will get better financing in the future. And look, that's true of each of the sectors that we've talked about, whether it's energy, mining, building, petrochemicals across the world, cement, steel, etc., where Vishal made the point, it's not about, these sectors are termed as hard to abate, but if you frame the question as possible to abate, then you can start having conversations about, look, is energy intensity the right metric, or overall emissions? To what extent can carbon capture technology, if it doesn't exist, be part of your CapEx in terms of investment in the future? or be part of your plans currently? To what extent do carbon credits form part of your near-term plan, if not part of your longer-term plan? And these are things that CBI is obviously investigating as part of its transitions program. So look, these issues aren't simple, but I think from our perspective, what we see as LSEG is that companies which are starting through the journey of defining the strategic priorities at a board level, starting to make disclosures under TCFD, starting to set their pathways, and then engaging with investors on a consistent basis, they have started outperforming their peers. And this trend is not going to change given the regulatory drivers and the macro environment that we live in. So that's the first main point. I think the second point that I wanted to cover is that, yes, I think it's a no-brainer that better disclosure will be part of the future, not just as a listed company on the likes of the NSE, the BSE, or the London Stock Exchange and other exchanges across the world. But even if you're a private company, there's an expectation now from your financiers, whether they be the banks or whether they be private investors, that you would need to make disclosures in line with standards which are developing. And of course, SEBI is considering this in India. I know our colleagues and our friends at the National Stock Exchange are building their own ESG proposition as well, very similar to ESG propositions which have been built internationally. But I think the first step is going through what is setting up a disclosure framework to the extent possible in line with TCFD, and then engaging with industry initiatives like SBTI, CDP, amongst others, who can help set pathways, and then engaging in financing. And then you can do some more elaborate structuring, for example, bringing social KPIs together with what are carbon-related or climate-related KPIs. But, it's a journey of 1,000 steps, and you can't run before you start walking. And that, I think, is very close to the point on green financing and the MSME sector. It has to start with banking, it has to start with accountants, it has to start with the board, it has to start with disclosure, because otherwise it becomes, where do we go? And that's certainly what we're finding about companies at the LSE. Now, one more point, Karthik, before I hand back to you. I think in India, even international debt capital markets, there are about 30, 40 companies who tap markets regularly. And what we're seeing is it's the same companies which are now tapping green, social, sustainability, and SLB markets. So there is a big question which has to be answered, which is how do you extend that across the board, right? And how do you incentivize more issuers to tap the market? Because in the short run, it'll be a question of incentivization. In the long run, it'll be a question of access. And we don't want a situation to be lack of access because of not making the right disclosures.
Thank you. Point well taken, Shrey, in terms of the diversity of issuers and the depth as well. I do like the question about the MSMEs, and maybe Monish, Apurva, you can come in given the broader perspective, and otherwise it's very institutional and company level. Obviously, in my experience with the ADB and CBI elsewhere, there are lots of cases of SLLs, as in loans, and also development banks, which are coming in to help these kind of smaller companies, because the ticket size is an issue, right? Not everybody can go to the bond market. What is the avenues for them to go and still maintain the level of rigor and visibility that they can prove that they are credible as green? So it'd be great if Manish, you first, and then Apurva can comment a bit on the MSME. There's other questions, Shrey, I'll come back to you on regulation, policy, as well as taxonomy, and we can come back to that. But let's cover this MSME point. And,
thanks, Karthik. Some very valid points by the illustrious panel. MSME sector is more about surviving than thinking about climate. And you have to actually get them to start thinking about survivability with climate. And when you want to do things as the global evolved markets have done in an Indian market, you need to be able to allocate some resource capital in the MSME sector to do that. You need to be able to train and guide the MSME sector to tread that path. And these are aspects which need to be built in the financial models of the MSME sector. Traditionally, it is not done. The banks and financial institutions which appraise the models are so skewed in their appraisal systems that if you don't tick the tick box of having a hard collateral, having capability of X percentage available in terms of collateralization, the MSME sector is not able to even access formal banking capital, leave alone climate bonds and leave alone the overseas markets. And hence, you see this problem existing in India and the emerging markets, that they aren't able to access the capital which actually should come into the sector. So I don't mean to say dilute it, but what I mean to say is, let's also start a process of hand-holding the MSME sector to be able to reach where we wanted to as a goal. And I take that as a personal example. Shell, the global giant, is invested in Prespil. And they followed Prespil, my company, for 2 years. And I won't name the gentleman. At the end of it, he told me it'll be next to impossible to invest in Prespil because what we want as the minimum standards, you might take years to achieve it. And I took 90 days from them. And I went to all the possible consultants. And all of them told me, we'll guide you what to do, but we won't do it. And I said, if you're going to guide me what to do, and after that I have to do it myself, I might as well do it on the ground, spending that capital. And we did it. And in 90 days, we had a global review by Shell, and they invested. And the reason was, they said, if in 90 days as a path you can tread vertically, you can take off, you can do it in terms of wonders over the years of time. And we are happy with that. And that's what is actually required. You need to be able to support the MSME sector to make the transition for reporting, make the transition for EHSG, make the transition to understand what is required to be able to get that low-cost capital which is available. So capital is not a problem. How do you access it in the MSME sector is a problem, and we need to work on that. And I think that's where the transition will start coming. That's where companies in the MSME sector will start going and becoming those global giants to access this capital. So that's one segment. I'll just take a minute here on the other part. We need to move towards project financing basing structures in the MSME sector. We need to move towards credit risk guarantee structures to support the MSME sector. We need to have governments, policymakers, regulators, infrastructure funds start putting in risk capital for the MSME sector to ensure that the climate change or the mitigation policies that we are putting on paper actually translate on the ground. And none of it is happening. These are difficult things to do on the ground. So we are very good in making paper policies because we cut, copy, paste the best all over the world. We are the least pathetic in terms of implementation. We just don't do implementation on the ground. And actually, you need to start implementing and then take it in terms of announcement what you can do. And that's where I think the large corporates, hats off to them, the Vedantas and the Aditya Birlas of the world, are actually now walking the talk. They're actually moving ahead to do this and set their own goals, set their reportings. A lot needs to still be done on the reporting standards. Somebody spoke about it. How do you benchmark it? What is the reporting standard for an India and an emerging market and a reporting standard for a Europe or a US market? Is it same? Can it be same? It can't be same. Today, if India as a population has to feed the below the radar, the segment of the society, they're not going to think about climate. So how do you put that into practice is the challenge. And I think it needs to start by having a carbon pricing, by having a carbon tax, putting that carrot and that penalty in place. We have put the carrot, we yet not put the penalty. Let's start penalizing, and that's where we will see the shift happening. Thanks.
Thank you. So Apurva, how do you think we can help the MSMEs?
I think Manish touched upon a lot of issues around MSME finance, some really good sort of recommendations. But I think one of the primary challenges with finance, whether it's for large companies or for MSMEs, is the uncertainty. Today we need the finance to enhance our domestic manufacturing capacity. That's urgent and undoubtedly, we missed the boat when it came to solar. India is still largely sort of import dependent when it comes to solar modules or batteries, or for that matter, even sort of LEDs, because manufacturing actually couldn't grow at the same pace as our ambition, right? So our domestic manufacturing couldn't grow at the same pace as our ambition. Our ambition was pretty huge. and was also a play on numbers eventually. It was about who could bid the lowest. So it could actually go the same way with batteries if you're not careful, right? If you look at the recent if you look at recent times, whether it's the Ukraine crisis or the semiconductor crisis, if it has taught us something, it is that one needs to be self-sufficient when it comes to our own needs, including our sort of energy technology needs. But one has to concede that, right, that there are larger geopolitical challenges with enhancing our manufacturing base, given that, a lot of the important mineral resources like lithium, cobalt, they're actually accumulated in a few sets of countries. We also have a lot to do in terms of building efficient supply chains for required raw materials that can actually help us decarbonize faster. So unless there's clarity and long-term policy signals, the finance community is also hesitant, right? And rightly so. And I agree with you in terms of the kind of green instruments like green bonds or SLBs. The ticket size is huge, right? It's not something that a small player can end up playing in. It's just the bigger players, right? But perhaps tokenization or digitization in the future can actually help us sort of ramp up market activity. The specific effort that Shrey spoke about with the NSE, right? Like building that separate green product kind of an exchange. If it can actually help tokenize these larger sort of bonds, we could get a lot more market activity. It could be traded more often. We could see a lot more traction, right? Even for smaller players. But I feel like there's some way to go in that. I think these are all early steps, but I think we're all going in the right direction.
Thank you. Quite a few interesting points. So this
sorry, Karthik, just
another point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I want to pass on to Gaurav and sorry, so who was that? Sorry, I missed.
No, I was just saying Gaurav first, but I'll put a few links in terms of reporting guidance that we've provided LSE companies, for example, on ESG reporting as well as climate transition reporting. In the UK, for example, TCFD alignment is now mandatory for companies listed on our equity markets. And from 2022, it's mandatory for companies also to have climate transition plans. And this, to Barbara's point, is to help investors effectively analyze companies and ensure that they're aligned with their own requirements coming in European directives like SFDR, or on the TCFD side where investors have to disclose their own. But it goes to the point around capacity building and ensuring that there's enough knowledge in markets. So I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you. I want to take some time. There's quite a few questions.
Can I just make one point?
Yeah, sorry, just about with Gaurav. I was saying, just from a time check, I do want to spend some time with Vishal and Gaurav so you can react on, from your side as potentially, looking for capital. And also, there are some interesting questions in there which we can combine with our conversation, because I think they're actually leading to some of the things we're talking about anyway. So over to you, Gaurav, and then Vishal on your reactions from the sell side, so to speak, of how you're looking for finance and some of the inputs you got from Barbara and Shrey. Gaurav, go ahead.
So I think, just a couple of points I wanted to make on just transition conversation as well as the access to finance bit, right? There are two absolute givens on this. One, we have to make a transition to green quickly. Two, that we will require a lot of money to be able to do that, right? So accessibility to finance is one of the key levers in order for us to be able to move towards a greener SBTI-linked trajectory over the next 10 years, right? Because if we don't do it, if collectively, if we miss a 2030 target, it makes it that much harder to get to net zero by 2050 or 2070 or whatever the end year is. Now, from a finance perspective, and it might sound a little flippant, but I think we need to see the finance sector be a little careful about how many filters you put in order to be able to access that finance. And I can see a rationale around performance, and whether that performance is intensity based for an emerging coal-powered economy in the short term and transitions to an absolute base in the long term. Those are judgment calls that the particular finance players need to take, but they need to understand that this intensity story is equally important in the short term. When it comes to just transition, right, I think that's a much harder filter to talk about and pass, especially for an emerging economy. Right, we're looking at just transition over the next 30 to 40 years, right? Because that's the time period when we're starting to see a shutdown of coal power plants, etc. Between now and then, there is enough time to figure that out. I think what's more urgent is that we get the green power online, right? And so there's this balance that would need to be made between, do we put so many barriers in place that this access to finance becomes so difficult that many people, choose alternative options in the short term, right? So if I decide as a company that it's too difficult to access green finance, so let me just go down the route of putting up another coal power plant. I've changed the story for another 20, 30 years, right? I've delayed that from happening. So I think where is the urgency, and how do we make sure that the urgency translates into action? That's.
I don't know if it's just me, but I'm having some trouble with Gaurav's line. So Gaurav, you've frozen actually, so we missed a bit of the last parts. If you can hear us. If not, Vishal, do you want to come in on your thoughts while we wait for Gaurav to connect back in?
Yeah, Karthik. So in terms of total, let's say, capital required for cement sector as a whole, if you look at cement sector currently is of a size of about $320 billion globally as of now. And in terms of going to net zero by 2050, the level of investment required is 1 trillion. So you're looking at almost 3 times the current size of a sector, equivalent investment which is required to completely decarbonize the sector. So the challenge is huge, and the similar challenge also stays for us. And I think a lot of points have already got discussed, but Ultratech as a business, of course, is looking at newer ways to tap finances, newer ways to fund this kind of projects, right? One of those we have already done, and we have spoken a lot in terms of going to market and raising the sustainability linked bonds. Of course, SLB, the share of proceeds are not going 100%, but yes, part of the share of proceeds are going towards low carbon technology and low carbon projects. But we are also trying to see, okay, let's say a particular technology currently in terms of short term where we need finance is waste heat recovery. So based on our capital, what we have in terms of capital allocation, we are maximizing investments in waste heat recovery. But we are also looking at options of how innovative finance can come into play so that the ramp up can happen quickly. So based on our capital, let's say we'll be able to add more waste heat recovery projects in maybe next 3 to 5 years. But we are looking at multilateral agencies like ADB, World Bank. If they can create a particular platform and they can get a technology company who can put waste heat recoveries and then maybe charge us based on energy consumption, right? So that is it's a newer or innovative way of looking at funding this kind of technologies and projects. The other big piece of investment which is required, of course, is carbon capture and storage. And per ton of CO2 to be saved for cement as a sector, the level of investment required here is almost like $100 plus. So here we are looking at more in terms of, for us, we are evaluating projects at pilot scale. We have not yet made a decision. We are very close to making a decision to make investment into a sizable pilot project. But if there is a coherent policy to back that, then it becomes easier for the businesses like us to make those kind of calls. So unless those policy indicators that are there in form of maybe a carbon tax or some form of regime, which makes it easier for businesses like us to look at the level of investment and also look at what are the kind of returns we'll be able to make from this kind of project. Because unless returns are there, it becomes challenging for boards to maybe approve projects of such size, right? Because $100 per ton of CO2, like 1 ton of cement, the level of investment which is required currently is about $75 to $100. And we are looking at almost same size of investment required just to capture that ton of CO2. But yes, point well taken. We as business are looking at different ways of financing the whole transition piece. The piece on MSME, what I see is this is more of a personal opinion, but when companies are going to take aggressive targets on scope 3 reduction, right? So their companies will set CO2 reduction not just from an operational point of view, but from a value chain point of view as well. When large businesses will start taking targets, they themselves will also figure out and influence maybe the transition for the value chain companies. And that's the time when I see that most of the access to barriers from both finance and technology would get addressed from the smaller size organizations or MSMEs as well.
Thank you. While I've got you there, both Gaurav and Vishal, some of the questions are quite interesting, which I would address to you, and I think it's relevant. So one is, what are you doing in terms of the green hydrogen space? And is it really worth looking at this point in time on green hydrogen when natural gas and coal prices are touching an all-time high? What is your take on it? So either of you. Actually, I might add, there's a question about, given supply chain, on the trucking sector, in terms of transport for supply chains, I guess. What are you doing about it, and how can that be intervened on? So between you, or both of you, if you can try and answer.
We're definitely looking at green hydrogen, Karthik. It's still, we're exploring R&D partnerships at the moment to see how this works out. As Apurva said in the beginning, that it's green hydrogen is definitely one of those levers that would need to come in, especially for like the iron and steel sector, right? That without green hydrogen, it becomes very difficult to decarbonize that sector. So it's still all cards on the table with this technology, and we'll see how it transitions. What we are giving ourselves is about 7 or 8 years before we see something really commercially viable materialize. That's what we are anticipating.
Thank you. Vishal, anything you want to comment on?
From a cement point of view, Karthik, still hydrogen as a, let's say, energy source is not looked at as one of the key levers, because the technology doesn't exist where maybe for a captive power plant you can look at, but captive power plant, if you see, let's say Ultratech has stopped investing into any coal-based captive power plant for last 3 years. We commissioned one of our own projects some 5 years back. There we have not gone ahead with thermal captive based power plant. We have just had our waste heat recovery, and we have started maximizing the renewable power source. So and also if you look at the Niti Aayog policy document and focus areas in terms of which all sectors they are focusing, cement actually doesn't feature over there. But green hydrogen, one area where we are looking at for green hydrogen is when we look at carbon capture and utilization. So there, for the source of energy, because you will need so much of energy to run the whole capture and utilization plants, there we are looking at green hydrogen as one of the technology to have a completely net zero plant to be established, maybe first initially at pilot scale, but maybe by 2030, like GCC as a body has taken a commitment by 2030. I think there will be like 15 or 20 commercial plants of carbon capture running globally on behalf of the whole sector. So we see around 2030, maybe green hydrogen playing a role largely into the carbon capture and utilization, and not into our co-manufacturing area.
Just on the logistics part, Karthik, what we found really useful with this whole thing is to take public targets on this. So as part of our net zero commitments, what we've said is 100% of our LMV fleet will be decarbonized by 2030, and 75% of our mining fleet, which is underground mining, large underground mining vehicles, will be decarbonized by 2035. And we've already started signing MOUs with certain partners, such as Sandvik, for our underground operations to put battery electric vehicles on the shop floor.
Thank you. There's one question, Barbara, which you maybe, because we did talk about this, and it's quite a frequent question on the downsizing. Actually, what we mean is the step down on SLBs. As we discussed, is that perverse? Is that actually leading to greenwashing? how have you dealt with that, or what's your view on that? So.
Well, on the step down, I mean, we are mainly bond investors. So we currently, I'm part of the global fixed income team. So at the moment, we're not participating in sort of sustainability linked loans particularly. So on the bond sides, the step down concept becomes quite tricky to implement because it has a whole series of implications also when it comes to the credit analysis. I mean, arguably it's the same credit that is issuing the bond. So there's already been some discussions, for example, with some of the issuers about alternative ways to use potentially the step up, with some suggesting that they would not pay it back as a coupon step up, but for example, pay it in charities or NGOs for reforestation, for other emissions reduction activities. And this was already somehow not so straightforward in the market, because clearly in the context of public markets investment, we also have a sort of fiduciary mandate to our ultimate sort of clients and constituents. So to that extent, the step down in a large bond issuance maybe a little bit tricky, and potentially lead the issuer, in our view, to set some targets that are too easy to achieve in order to benefit from the step down. It's a mechanism that we have seen most of the times, again, in bilateral sort of lending arrangements, and mostly attached to, for example, ESG ratings, and associated with a commitment not to deteriorate, for example, the ESG rating, which is somehow a different perspective, because it entails like some sort of external verification. It entails the maintenance of at least a minimum level. So it makes sense in that context. But a step down for bond issuances for specific KPIs, we feel would be potentially an incentive to set targets that are too easy to achieve in a context where, as I was mentioning before, the market already suffers from a tendency to set relatively easy targets overall. So we don't look at it at this stage with a particularly favorable eye. But I mean, clearly we, as always, we follow the sort of market discussions and are open to further brainstorming on this topic and to innovations in the labeled sustainable bond market. Maybe if I'm allowed, I just wanted to make one more comment related to the MSME point that was touched upon before. I think a very important role in terms of directing and channeling capital towards those companies is also played by the banks, especially in India in the context of green sustainable bond issuance. We haven't seen that much from financial institutions. And if we think about banks, other financial institutions, aiming to issue more in green format attached to their renewable energy and other sort of green lending, green buildings, sort of lending pool, then they could also act as a facilitator for basically aggregating all of those green underlying projects at the micro and SME level. And they could also potentially provide incentives in their direct lending terms to those companies in order to build that eligible pool of assets that they would then leverage for their own green bond issuance. So in general, I think financial institutions have a very important role to play in terms of opening that door and allowing those smaller companies to access this market, and clearly they also provide the sort of technical expertise to facilitate the type of disclosure that is needed to this end.
Thank you for addressing the MSME point too. We're pretty much on time, so which I expected, and I have to say I have to thank the audience for some amazing questions. We haven't been able to answer all of them, but I think at least some element of them we've touched on. But I think there's a host of menu of things we've talked about today all the way from the KPI setting through to the points about MSME and policy, as well as carbon tax. And I guess the way, apart from thanking all the panelists for your great inputs, this is an ongoing conversation. As we know, it's such a big task for India and for even at a company level. But I guess I want to close with that question, which is probably on everybody's mind. Shrey and Barbara, what is your feel? Are you bullish on India based on what you've heard in terms of the conversation? We know it's all the journey. It's probably similar in many other countries, despite being EM or not. But why don't we get a general sense from you in terms of how do you think, are we going in the right direction? Are we lacking something completely? There's one question about taxonomy. I might just chime in the interest of time, that we are Climate Bonds and other partners, KPMG, UNDP, are working with the Ministry of Finance on an Indian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. So that's already underway. So what else do we need to do? And what is your feel on India at this stage? Barbara and Shrey.
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief, as I just spoke quite a lot. But from a sustainability perspective, I would say actually very positive. I think all the right sort of key elements are there in terms of incentives, in terms of access to the right green and sustainable financing structures. And clearly, there's a lot of potential from a business perspective to develop all these this technology, and there's the right sort of access to skills and talent that is needed to sort of fast track and accelerate the development of those technologies. I think in general, clearly we. I would reiterate once again the point on the importance of transparency, on robust governance, of looking at the whole supply chain, and try as much as possible to sort of implement a holistic approach to the low carbon transition, and not only siloed on one specific dimension of that. And finally, in the context of the taxonomy, which you've mentioned, I think a very, very important point from our investor perspective would be having increasing access to forward-looking metrics. So again, being able to support our low carbon transition investments by saying, okay, for example, this company, including a government-owned company, for example, in the power sector, in the energy sector, is currently a high emitter, but the prospects of its decarbonization are incredibly positive. They are going to invest X amount over the next 3 to 5 years. So having that type of access of, for example, proportion of green capex to total capex as a very basic, straightforward figure is going to be quite crucial for us to make investment decisions.
Thank you. And that goes to the heart of your point about how material and ambitious it is. And I think the paper on credible transitions, we refer to that as well as, the clear capex plan rather than just a statement or a pledge is not enough. So I think that's what the investor looks for. Shrey, over to you.
So, I mean, I think the short answer is very bullish. From when I personally began having conversation with Indian companies raising capital using international markets like the London Stock Exchange, about 15 years ago to now, I think the last visit I made to India, there wasn't a single conversation where ESG disclosure, sustainable bond markets, green revenues was not part of the conversation. And I don't think this is just lip service. This is very much in preparation for what India committed at COP26, not just committed at COP26, but has translated into sectoral milestones as well. And look, it's increasingly filtering across supply chains, across decision-making processes. And I think one of the other things which is very much going for the Indian corporate sector is the fact that the diaspora is spread across the world in different parts and in different parts of the supply and the financial chain as well. So there is a lot of knowledge sharing which is happening at the moment, which will translate into pathways, and pathways will accelerate, I think, over time as the fact that we live in this climate crisis becomes just more and more apparent. I mean, it's 47 degrees here now in Delhi, and that's now the average, which is just a sign of what's happening.
Thank you. Look, we're over time, but I think it's been useful and very engaging conversation. And I think we've come up with more questions, which is okay, I think, where we are in the world at this stage. So I'd like to thank the panelists for being so generous with your time and also with your inputs and very clear signals you're given, and the audience for some fantastic questions. We can still take them offline. I'm sure Leticia from our team will help with any emails. I think, Apurva, there were some specific ones for you in terms of carbon storage and capture and geological policy. So we can come to that offline so that we don't keep everybody hanging for too long. Thank you once again. Please keep in touch and let's keep the conversation going and keep the sentiment bullish, as Shrey said. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.